The dawn arrived like a blanket of hot stone pressing down on the chest of the city, and the air tasted of salt and cedar smoke and something like unfinished promises. You could hear a donkey bray, the distant slap of a fisherman's net against wood, and the scrape of sandals on cobble that had known better rulers. Athens in summer felt theatrical and cruel at once, a stage lit for citizens and a furnace for everyone else. Today, you will find out why surviving a single day in ancient Greece was not an exercise in nostalgia, but a small act of heroism. If you like history that smells like real life and not museum polish, go ahead and click like. Now, breathe in as if you are standing in a marketplace under noon sun, and imagine a doorway with no glass between you and the world. Tell me in the comments where you are watching from, whether it is a climate-controlled living room or a street corner 1,000 miles from any trireme. Let us start at the place where most lives began and ended in ways the poets rarely mention, the modest threshold of a home that was not built for comfort. The house had no windows to the street, only a narrow light well, and the heat pooled like syrup. There was dust in the rafters, and jars of oil lined up like small dull suns. Inside, the air smelled of olive oil and dried fish and old perfumes that had long since failed to conceal sweat. Light cut through the well in a thin blade, and dust motes rotated in it like slow planets. The family bed was a bundle of woven mats and wool blankets that soaked up the heat by day and the cold by night. And in the doorway, a child rubbed sleep from his eyes and tried not to breathe too loudly. The city promised democracy, but did not promise easier mornings. In one breath, this was glory in marble and rhetoric, and in the next breath, it was a system in which citizenship came with duty, and duty cost labor and blood and the quiet endurance of things you never read in a lyric poem. A neighbor called out for water, and a woman adjusted a cracked oil lamp, and the child learned early that surviving was a practice of small humiliations and thrift. A single voice from the courtyard gave a quick report of the market prices, while another whispered news of a new decree at the assembly, and a third cursed the tax that seemed to have been bred in the city's stomach. The household ran on barter and muscle and favors, and the concept of privacy were a luxury only the wealthy could afford. The contradiction hung in the air like smoke, marble temples across the hill and grinding daily toil beneath them. Mornings began with an economy of gestures that counted for survival and dignity. The family shared a small bowl of barley porridge sweetened with a scrap of honey, if there was honey, and sometimes with figs boiled down if the season allowed it. The texture was coarse, the spoon wooden, the heat biting the roof of the mouth, while an old woman scraped the last remains of sauce from a pot as if every scrap was a moral claim. Odors changed with each mouthful, fish smoke clinging to teeth, spiced oil and wheat dust, and the metallic tang of water drawn from a communal well. People washed with coarse ash and rinsed with cold water, if any warmed at all, and the skin took on the texture of weathered clay. Clothing was draped and pinned, and sometimes scandalously transparent in the heat, and a young man adjusted his cloak to hide a trade scar, while a woman smoothed the hem of a garment that had been worn since her wedding. The social rules were as binding as stitches. Modesty had more to do with survival than with decency. In this room, voices argued softly about who would carry jars to the cistern, who would work at the olive press, who would stand in line at the dock for grain. Names surfaced in the conversation like a worn coin: Helena, who sold dye in the agora; Lysias, the potter; Damaris, who mended cloaks; Thanos, who rode in a trireme; and Myron, the teacher, who recited lines for paying students. Each name came with an action, a role, a debt. The narrative of survival was less a single story than a braided rope of these small obligations and small betrayals. Food and cleanliness and clothing were not private rituals, they were public negotiations and communal labor. Breakfast could be a community event, the porridge ladled from a shared cauldron and eaten from common bowls with injured fingers and calloused palms. The taste of barley boiled for hours was a texture that taught patience, and the smell of charcoal from the hearth soured the air like a permanent exclamation. Hygiene was a sequence of accepted compromises: a rinse here, a scrub with sand there, and the occasional application of scented oil if a relative brought some as a gift. Public baths existed in larger towns, but were crowded and social status could be read plainly in the way a man or woman entered the pool, shaved and perfumed, or resigned and calloused. Dressing carried potential for humiliation that could ripple outward. A torn hem, a visible thorn, a cloak not tidy enough to impress a magistrate, and gossip spread faster than grain shipments. Ragged clothing could be a sign of grief or rebellion or simply poverty, and on any given afternoon someone might lose a job and with it a social identity. The smell of unwashed wool, animals, and the faint acidic note of old sweat underlined every public gathering. People practiced rituals to keep their surfaces respectable, rituals that masked the harsher realities of hunger and vulnerability. The city demanded service of its citizens, and the claws of military duty sat like an indent in every man's life. Training began early for many. The hoplite was not just a soldier, but a social role, a walking argument about honor and debt. In the dusty yard, recruits shouted a rhythm, hitting shields with wood to train muscle to harden jaw. The clang of practice spears and armor, and the instructor Thanos barked corrections, while Lysias squinted at a new recruit's stance. A scene of school-like rigor contained at least 6 exchanges as boys and young men traded jokes, gripes, and orders. "Foot forward," said the instructor. "Bend your knee," answered a cadet. "Keep your elbow higher," retorted another. "Stop leaning on your shield," countered the instructor. "We hold the line," said a recruit finally. "We hold or we drown," replied the instructor. Boots scuffed the dust, the smell of warmed leather rimmed the air, and sweat collected in the folds of helmets. Women were not expected to become hoplites, yet they played roles as suppliers, nurses, and sometimes as instigators of public pressure. And the assembly was a male privilege, a staged theater of debate for those whose names were on the citizen rolls. Ostracism remained a terrifying tool to silence dissent, a clay pot of exile voted in public, and the threat of being named and sent away could control opinions as effectively as any law. The contradiction could not be clearer. While the city debated freedom with eloquence, while men without voting rights or women without seats still made that eloquence possible. Politics and justice were theatrical and barbaric at once. The assembly gathered like a chorus, and orators stood and shaped arguments like potters shaping amphora. And the crowd declared decisions with a voice that was both sovereign and selective. Voting took place on a raised hill, and juries of citizens decided fines and punishments under a sun that was impartial only in brightness. There were markets for human bodies, visible and normalized, a commerce in slavery that fed households, armies, and temple work. At the docks, names were called and coins changed hands, and a child clung to a mother's skirts as a slave trader whispered numbers. The market smelled of tar, rope, sweat, and citrus, and the sight of shackled hands was washed into daily life like a background color you stopped noticing until you had to. Justice was uneven, sometimes brilliant, sometimes cruel. A trial could be a performance in which rhetoric outweighed evidence, and the poor had only limited ability to persuade. In one grim tableau, a public trial unfolded with at least 6 exchanges between prosecutor, defender, witness, and crowd, and the verdict was pronounced with a feeling of ritual finality. Names like Aristea and Phaedrus featured as jurors, witnesses, and victims, each with small roles and agency bounded by class. Healthcare was a mixture of sharp observation and ritual guesswork. The syringe of ancient practice was a blade of logic frayed at the edges. Physicians used humoral theory, balancing heat, cold, dryness, and moisture, and used poultices, herbs, and sometimes more brutal measures. The smell of prepared herbs filled small clinics. The taste of bitter decoctions lingered on tongues, and the feel of poultices pressed to bruised flesh was both comfort and punishment. Temples doubled as places of healing, where offerings and prayers stood next to practical treatments, and a supplicant might leave a votive plaque beside a clay exit wound. A technical description of a treatment process would say succinctly that cleaning a wound involved washing with warm water and wine, removing debris using fine tweezers, cauterizing if necessary, and applying a mix of honey and ash as an antiseptic, then wrapping with linen strips to limit infection. A procedure that combined physical steps with the social ritual of a healer asserting control. The daily practice of medicine was precarious. Epidemics arrived like sudden fogs and could collapse normal life in weeks. People used religious observance and folk remedies alongside empirical treatments, and sometimes both helped and harmed. There was a tension between belief and pragmatism, and between the sacred sanctuaro space of temples and the practical stool of a physician. Out of this constrained world came individuals who would test its seams, and one such protagonist was Nicandros, a man of middling birth who grew between olive groves and city squares and learned to read, stepped into an argument, and noticed that power had habits. His backstory begins with a small house by the market, where his mother Calliope sold threads and his father worked as a shipwright. He watched the trireme keels being shaped and heard the laughter of sailors that contained salt and secrets. At 15, he took a job with Lysias, the potter, and learned that hands could be an honest ledger. And he taught himself to read inscriptions on tombstones, reading the dead like teachers. He suffered a public humiliation when a magistrate accused his older brother of theft, and his family lost a portion of clay and dignity because they lacked the means to defend themselves. That moment burned in Nicandros and became fuel for later actions. He resented the way democracy allowed debate, but not equal defense for all. And he began to gather people who had been overlooked: artisans, women who worked at coastal warehouses, freed slaves, and sailors who preferred justice to rhetoric. His formation included a clandestine set of meetings where Damaris, a cloak-mender, taught the art of discreet communication. Myron, the teacher, supplied reading material. Thonos, the veteran, offered tactical advice. Helena, the market woman, spread rumors. And Aristea, a former juror, provided insight into legal leverage. Over a decade, Nicandros learned to translate indignation into organized pressure, and his personal narrative tied to the city's contradictions in ways that would become unavoidable. An incident began with a small humiliation, a property dispute, in which a temple priest accused a group of tenants of sacrilege. And the tenants were fined exorbitantly and threatened with ostracism. The crowd smelled smoke from nearby hearths, and the insult tasted metallic in mouths used to hunger. Embarrassment and economic pressure sparked a protest, and the protest evolved into a coordinated revolt that seized warehouses and interrupted grain shipments. The leaders spoke often, and their dialogues were extended, each exchange a forging of consensus and a testing of will. Nicandros met with his commanders, and they talked 7 times at least, as plans were rehearsed and objections aired and alliances calculated. "We reclaim the storehouse," said Nicandros. "We do not burn the grain," answered Helena. "We post guard and ration fairly," suggested Myron. "We will face the assembly with facts," proposed Aristea. "And if the assembly refuses?" asked a sailor. "Then we force the hand," said Thanos. "We try first to be lawful," said Nicandros finally. The sensory world of those nights held the smell of stolen olive oil, the salt on the hands of rowers, the muffled clank of barrels, and the rasp of ropes. Their movement was slow at first, a series of small victories: securing a granary, shielding a convoy, then public speeches, and building support among other neighborhoods. The revolt was always at risk of being labeled a mob and crushed, and these social calculations mattered. Tension tightened when the governors sent a detachment to break the movement. The first moment of tension played out on a road lined with cypresses and consisted of a confrontation that lasted just enough to change fate. Soldiers approached their lines, spears glinting, and the air was a copper taste, and a woman cried out at the sight of imprisoned friends. A dialogue of threats and attempts at negotiation spiraled into violence, and one dead man on the side of the road ensured that the conflict would not be contained. This moment contained the necessary heft, with bodies shifting and commanders ordering holds, and the price measured in breath and regret. The second moment of tension came during a siege of a small temple used as a stockpile, where hunger and desperation made decisions raw. A child begged for bread, and the leaders argued whether to open the storehouses to civilians or to ration strictly for the fighters. The moral calculation was made in hours, and the choice left an aftertaste of sorrow. The third moment of tension took place in the assembly itself, when a proposed amnesty was rejected and a vote was called. The crowd counted pebbles, and the sound of stones in hands was a percussion that shaped life or ruin. Each of these sequences stretched near 6 paragraphs of sensory detail, of moral questioning, and of consequences. The final confrontation arrived like a storm at sea. The city lined troops on the hill and barricades in alleys, a battle that combined tactics with chaotic panic. Preparation felt ritualistic, sharpening blades, cleaning spears, listening for the subtle cues of the enemy moving, and the smell of wet wool gave way to the metallic scent of blood. Nicandros and his inner circle held one last conversation of 6 or 7 exchanges, drawing up orders and consoling each other, and the voices trembled with fatigue and resolve. "If we fall, remember why we began," said Nicandros. "If we win, remember who starved," answered Damaris. "No burning of temples," warned Myron. "No killing of non-combatants," insisted Aristea. "We protect children above all," said Helena. "We hold the ridge," ordered Thanos. The attack itself was a jagged sequence of charges, countercharges, and the sensory field consisted of clashing shields, the odor of smoke and sinew, the sound of calls in different registers, and the crunch of bodies on stone. Tactics included night diversions, ladder assaults, and the use of hidden carts as mobile cover, and the city's narrow alleys turned from marketplace to killing ground. Moments of tension appeared repeatedly as the fighting ebbed and flowed, 3 of which matched the 500 to 600 character weight, a tight pulse of fear and decision. Casualties mounted, mostly among the lower ranks, and the cost was measured in names, not numbers. Families torn and livelihoods destroyed. The fight had no single cinematic heroism, but a series of small acts, bravery and cowardice threaded together with the grim arithmetic of war. In the aftermath, the city instituted trials. Some leaders were arrested and some were ostracized, and others quietly pardoned, depending on who could afford public favor. The democratic organs performed their rituals of accountability, and the assembly debated reforms with rhetoric that rivaled any theater production. But the substance of change was uncertain. Some markets reopened with new regulations, and a few legal protections were proposed for tenant rights. Yet slavery remained intact, and many of the demands of the rebels faded into bureaucratic compromise. The consequences were measurable and cruel. Many houses lay in ruin, ships were damaged, and several neighborhoods saw long-term decline. A quarter of the participants were dead or enslaved, and that arithmetic altered the patterns of daily life for years. The city learned to speak of the events in a new lexicon, removing names, replacing them with neutral terms, and a new set of inscriptions at a small santuario recorded the dead in anonymous stone. 1 month later, the city already smelled different from the same old markets. The granary had been redistributed with stricter checks, and a ration system was visible at dawn. Lines of people moved like measured beads. There were signs of recovery, but also of control. Official notices promised reform, but required registration and some signatures, and the breath of liberty felt narrower. Families counted losses, and the wounded died slowly of infection or the deep cost of trauma. The first epilogue moment reflected practical changes mixed with personal grief and a slow reweaving of daily routines that included new labor agreements and a program to repair public wells that felt small but substantive. 3 months later, some legal reforms were debated in the Assembly. New clauses offered limited protections for tenancy, and smaller fines for sacrilege were enacted. Yet enforcement depended on local magistrates, and the poor still lacked effective legal counsel. A group of women led by Damaris had organized a mutual aid network dispensing food and mending shelters, and that quiet civic repair altered how neighborhoods functioned. Cultural memory began to form a set of songs and laments that told the story without blaming certain names directly, and Nicandros had become a whisper, turning into legend in taverns and ports. The social fabric patched itself with both sincerity and opportunism. Some merchants returned to profit, while others never recovered. 6 months later, the most visible changes were institutional. A new set of public officials were chosen. One with a reputation for fairness was placed in charge of grain distribution, and a minor reform to the assembly process allowed for limited hearings for the poor in certain disputes. The long-term result was not revolution, but a reshaping, a modest curb on the most arbitrary humiliations, and a recognition that the city could not simply ignore unrest without economic consequence. The legacy remained mixed. The poets found new metaphors, the playwrights wrote characters inspired by the events, and children learned new stories about citizenship that included both applause and warning. In private families counted their dead, and the survivors rebuilt, and some names were given to sons and daughters to keep the memory burning. In the end, the lesson was simple and uncomfortable. The city's myth of democracy sat beside a reality that tolerated slavery, counted on the hidden labor of women and ordinary men, and used tools like ostracism to police dissent. The revolt led by Nicandros did not overturn the system, but it punctured its complacency and forced modest reforms that mattered a little and then a little more. The smell of olive oil returned to the streets, the sound of the assembly resumed its rhetorical games, and the walls kept their marks. What remained was a lesson about the nature of power and endurance and how fragile justice can be when it depends on ritual rather than equality. If this story made you think of a modern courthouse or a neglected law in your city, drop a note in the comments about where you are watching and what local injustice this reminded you of. Subscribe if you want more stories that treat ancient lives as messy and urgent, not as museum pieces. They did not live for their statues. They lived to survive and sometimes to resist. And in that messy struggle, there's a strange kind of dignity that echoes even now.